answer.
Okay.
Like the top 40%. I met him. You're the one who was talking about it.
So when will the clicker start working?
Huh?
When will the clicker start working?
Oh, when we start sharing the PowerPoint.
Okay. Good thing you understand how this works.
So that will go up.
Okay.
So when we're ready to do the PowerPoint, I'll come up and share it on here. Okay, you ready to start or unshare? Yeah.
Here's the PowerPoint.
Yeah, shall I bring it up now?
Yeah.
Better with the light on, see the screen? Stephen,
I'm fine, thanks. Yeah.
did you prefer the light on or off?
Off is good. On is good. Okay, let's get started then. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. And thanks to those online as well. Let's just pause. A couple of people are coming in. There's been a change of room, so I think some people have just arrived from the other room. Good. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this FEC seminar. FEC is the Food Equity Center. It's a relatively recent center that's been established. It has a secretariat here at IDS, but in fact, it's a consortium of partners from many countries around the world. And even in this particular presentation, you're going to hear partners from the UK, from South Africa, from Brazil. And the idea is that we are all interested in issues around food justice, food equity, and the inequality in outcomes in terms of access to food. And we're all working on that in different ways. So this seminar is called Challenging the Normalization of Hunger in Highly Unequal Societies. And we're going to have a brief introduction by me. I'm Stephen Devereux, I'm from IDS, and I'll be doing some conceptual framing of the issue. Then we're going to have presentations on Brazil from Renato, South Africa by Gareth, and Pata from the UK. And each of them, I'll ask them to introduce themselves when they start speaking. It's going to be short though, 6 minutes each, so we'll get through this in about half an hour. And then Scott Dreamy from South Africa will be the chair of the discussion that follows. Okay, so the center was founded with this idea that food inequity is a major challenge in the world and that it requires a multidisciplinary approach. So the question is, why do we find hunger or food insecurity or food inequity persisting across the world, even in relatively high income or middle income countries? That's our first paradox. Even in very high income countries, you'll find levels of hunger which we would say are higher than expected, higher than they should be. And we call this phenomenon the slow violence of hunger. We argue that food insecurity, hunger, and malnutrition are all outcomes of failures by society to ensure adequate access to food for all people. And we see this as a form of food injustice. And finally, we argue that the persistence of hunger, even in relatively wealthy countries, suggests a level of political tolerance and social acceptance of these outcomes. And we say that that reflects the normalization of hunger. In other words, there's not sufficient interest by society, by the citizens or by the governments to deal with it. And that's why it's allowed to persist, because in fact, we argue that it's avoidable and preventable. So our research agenda, this is a research agenda which we are building together as a center. So we're going to present some preliminary exploratory findings today, but we're also going to be developing this in the coming years. So our first research question or our agenda is, how and why are conditions of food deprivation allowed to persist in contemporary societies and socio-ecological systems? So we're going to look at food system inequalities, issues of social injustice, and public policy processes, looking at the policies that should be put in place to deal with this, but obviously aren't or aren't succeeding. And secondly, we're going to also solicit citizen perspectives. What do people themselves think about the persistence of hunger in their society? Then we're going to look at how the slow violence of avoidable hunger in food systems and outcomes is recognized and measured. And for that, we want to look at the drivers of the normalization of hunger. And we're also going to critically engage with the politics of food security measurement, because we argue that the way food security is conceptualized and measured also facilitates the process of food inequity. So our analytical framework, in green on the left, you see those two research questions, and we're going to look at citizen perspectives and policy processes to answer the first question. And for the second question on slow violence, we're looking at food security measurement and the normalization of hunger. We want to look at this in several countries across the world, and we've chosen 5, of which 3 we'll talk about today. So a high-income country where hunger has recently re-emerged as an issue or has become more prominent, which is the UK. 2 middle-income countries where the right to food is there, but is currently under threat, and those are Brazil and South Africa. And then later on, we'll start working in Ethiopia and India, which are historically famine-prone countries, but have successfully eradicated famine, but still have serious issues of hunger and food insecurity. And here's our first attempt at a conceptual framework, which has hunger as the outcome on the left, and then everything on to the right of that is to try to explain that outcome. So there are several actors which are involved in stopping hunger or allowing hunger to continue to persist, which include the state, non-state actors, the general public or citizens, and then hungry people themselves. There are many drivers that we'll look at. There's a black box there or a white box: history, politics, governance, etc. And then there are several disruptors, which will explain why we don't get the outcome that we want from the actions on the right-hand side. So if you look at across from the actors to the actions, states have laws and policies and programs. Non-state actors are engaged in mobilization, especially civil society, and advocacy. That's the media and academics like us as well. The general public have attitudes towards the poor and the hungry. And finally, hungry people themselves can exercise their anger through rioting and protesting. So between those actions and the outcome of hunger, there are a number of explanations that we need to get to about what's driving this outcome and what are the disruptors. So our research questions follow on from those 4 actors. If we start from the hungry people themselves, direct action. Why don't hungry people themselves take political action to demand that government delivers on their right to food? If we look at civil society, what are they doing on behalf of those suffering from hunger? What's the role of non-state actors? In each society, of course, this is not generalizable. So these research questions are for each country case. Thirdly, what are the attitudes towards hunger and hungry people that citizens hold in each of these countries? And finally, maybe the most significant one is the huge policy failures and political failures and governance failures that mean government interventions to combat hunger are either not there at all, or if they are there, they are inadequate, even in upper middle income countries and high income countries. So those give us a set of research questions that we will explore. We'll drill down in each of our countries. So just to quickly put up some very rough indicators of inequality, which explains why we feel that this is a paradoxical result. You have high levels, relatively high levels of income, you have high levels of inequality, so the capacity to intervene to prevent hunger is there, and yet it's not happening. So if you look at our 5 countries, you'll see that the top 10% control significantly more than the bottom 50% in terms of national income. So there is capacity there for redistribution. And you'll see that looking at the right-hand side, that the prevalence of moderate and severe food insecurity in our 5 countries is relatively high, except perhaps in the UK, but it's still there and has been rising in some countries in recent years. We suspect that in the UK, it's been rising since 2018 to 2020 as well, since COVID and now what's happening with the war in Ukraine and the spillover effects. So these are going to be our 5 case study countries. And today we'll present briefly preliminary findings from Brazil, South Africa, and the UK in that order. So I now want to hand over to Renato from Brazil, our colleague from Brazil. Renato, please introduce yourself briefly and then let me know when you want me to turn the page. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be part of this seminar. The presentation of the case study in Brazil starts by proposing this question: how can it be that Brazil, one of the world's leading food producers and exporters, has rising food insecurity and hunger? We try to answer, to address this question by using the lens of food politics, considering that we have a long-standing, let's say, tradition of politicization of hunger, and that came up more strongly after the military rule in 1985 with the redemocratization of country and the emergence of counter-hegemonic movements. So we passed through a period that we can call of democratic construction times since the first Lula's government until 2015, when the well-known zero-hunger strategy set in place in sectorial integrated policy, increasing employment, recovering the official minimum wage, cash transfer, support to family farmers, full meal, access to water. I mean, a wide bunch of programs. And in this, there has been an important role of political movement around food sovereignty and security, what we can call a political field of food and nutrition sovereignty and security and right to food, with a strong social participation in policy making, implementing, and monitoring. The Brazilian scale of food insecurity that has been that we made use since 2003 showed that in 2014 we reached the highest level of food security households, 77%, and only 4% of people facing severe food insecurity. That was the moment where Brazil has been taken off the FAO hunger map, and a strong recognition by the international community for almost overcoming hunger through effective government intervention. Next, please. But that has been followed by what I call the authoritarian times of deconstruction that start in 2016 and comes up to now, when we got the reversal of a virtuous trend that start in 2013, 2014, when we've got, after that, an economic crisis aggravated by the political crisis, the parliamentary coup in 2016. So the repercussions of that was the progressive increase in unemployment, interruption of the appreciation of the official minimum wage, expansion of uncertain fully paid work, setback in social protection, and retraction of support for family farming. And as an outcome of this reversal, we reached in 2022 the lowest level of food security households, only 41% could be considered like this. And we had 32.3 million people having to eat less, meaning a moderate degree of food insecurity, and 33 million people facing hunger, which means the severe food insecurity. Next, please. Just this figure, just to give you an idea of what I was mentioning. The first survey that utilized the Brazilian scale in 2004, we started with 64% of food security household, reaching 77% in 2013, and then start the reversal. And the two last surveys in 2020 and 2022 show quite clearly the worsening of the condition, the food and nutrition condition of the Brazilian population, which has reached this lower level of having around 31% of people facing moderate or severe food insecurity, and another 28% with light food insecurity. In total, that means 125 million people suffering from some degree of food insecurity. Next, please. And then I tried to make a sort of translation of the two questions posed by our project for the country case studies by proposing these two questions. First, to what extent does a focus on the normalization of hunger, which is the focus of our paper, contribute to interpreting its resurgence in contemporary Brazil? First of all, I have to reaffirm that having hunger is a historical normal feature of Brazilian society, one of the most unequal countries in the world. And I've just mentioned that the combination of the convergence of economic and political crisis, the progressive dismantling of fundamental public policy, and the advent of the pandemic, and the non-treatment given by the government aggravated the process in one of the most unequal societies in the world. Could this be a case in which economic and political elites sought to reestablish historical patterns in Brazilian society that normalize hunger and social inequality? It's important to mention that happened, but not without resistance. And the answer to the question requires considering specific characteristics of Brazilian food for food politics in Brazil. I can see that. Sorry, I have this problem here in the view, and the characteristics of food policy in Brazil. Next, please. And the second question is, what elements of the slow violence of avoidable hunger contribute to the normalization of hunger in Brazil? Do food security measures and indicators account for this relationship? First, the slow violence that generates avoidable hunger originates from factors that promote social inequality with systemic nature. We are now having lots of research showing how systemic inequalities coming from, specifically from food systems, are in place. Secondly, the orientation of public policy should encompass those aimed not only at food, but also with more general nature, employment and income. This is quite important to understand the way you should face food insecurity and hunger. This implies, in terms of measure, this implies the need to resort to measures capable of covering the multidimensionality of phenomena, such as hunger and poverty. We've been having the past the construction of a matrix of indicators analyzed in their interrelationship. And the Brazilian food security scale, like similar others, this was the measure that I just showed to you in that figure, like similar others, is important to reveal people's perception of the condition of their family, but it should be used in a complementary way to other indicators. And in this way, violence present in socioeconomic and political factors comes to the fore. At the same time that it's been clear that to face this question, we have that there is no silver bullet, as some economists used to say, but this requires a bunch of integrated and intersectoral policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renato. Can I now hand over to Gareth from South Africa? Please introduce yourself briefly, Gareth, and then go ahead with the South African case study.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Renato, for that. My name is Gareth Haysom. I'm a researcher at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. And my work is primarily urban focused, but having done work in food security and hunger and a number of other issues before. So very briefly, just to run through the South African case, and Stephen mentioned this in the introduction, but just to make a point that sort of close to half the population in South Africa experienced severe and moderate food insecurity in the period 2018 to 2020. So, quite a lot higher than Brazil in that. And that was pre-COVID. The figure on the right sort of indicates the changes that took place over through a number of surveys that were done during the COVID period. But what it represents in that middle bar is how after lockdown and once a whole set of interventions happened, hunger stayed constant and it didn't sort of go down below anything despite massive effort to try and reduce that. But this is largely because, and we argue, that hunger has been persistent in South Africa for a long time. And a whole number of surveys reflect this, from food consumption surveys to national sort of health and nutrition surveys to the different measures used by the statistical agencies, and even sort of research-based work, such as the African Food Security Urban Network done in sort of urban areas. So South Africa faces this triple challenge of all three forms of malnutrition. So overnutrition, undernutrition, and micronutrient deficiency. But equally, it has different forms of hunger. So chronic hunger, seasonal hunger, and acute. And so to highlight the seasonal hunger, next slide, please, Stephen. Just drill into that. So on the left is some work done in a rural area of our Northern Cape province, where one can see, as a result of seasonality and a traditional understanding of the hungry season, very high levels of food insecurity in the sort of non-harvest period of that, linked both to the sort of agricultural seasons and the sort of casualization of work. But that same impact happens in urban areas. So the figure on the right reflects, using a different measure, the months of adequate household food provisioning, reflects how even in urban areas, given the highly casualized nature of the South African economy and employment, because of construction work and the nature of sort of the tourism economy in the Western Cape. So this is from Cape Town. You see this shrinkage in employment opportunities, and you see these months of inadequate household food provisioning in what is the South African winter, so from June through to August. But equally other anomalies, the beginning of the economic year, as well as the school year in January, you see very high levels of inadequate provisioning. Even has a colloquial term here in Cape Town referred to as January around that. And the point that we make is this seasonal hunger is invisibilized. It's been normalized. It's not seen by the elites. It's suffered in silence. It's suffered within the household. And the households that experience severe hunger are just not seen. They sort of obscure. Next slide, please, Stephen. But this hunger that we encounter now is not just about now and not just a kind of challenge at the current political kind of structures. This hunger kind of reflects a far longer history of deep structural injustice, both economic and social injustice, as a result of 300 years of colonialism and apartheid policies. And these policies have led to what we argue is the normalization of food poverty in South Africa, where generations have had inadequate and depleted diets, where the focus has been on economic extraction, not on creating development and wellness. And so the diets have been reduced, and we see the outcomes of this now in rising levels of diet-related non-communicable diseases, persistent childhood stunting, and a number of other aspects around that. Next slide, please. So the kind of apartheid era, to focus on that specifically, privileged a particular class, the white farmer class, and it was a key constituent of the apartheid regime. And the amount of effort that went in to support that particular kind of grouping, it meant significant investment in agriculture, both in terms of research, in terms of production, in terms of subsidies, in terms of income support, tax breaks, etc., that led to this consolidation of agriculture. So we have a highly sophisticated industrialized agriculture sort of sector, but that was designed to privilege a white minority. Supermarkets came in. South Africa was one of the first kind of uptakes, and we're seen as an early adopter of that. But when the democratic government took over in 1994 and the sort of agriculture was liberalized and state support withdrawn, that particular group was ideally suited to capture that and resulted in what Stephen Greenberg refers to as this corporate-led food regime, which has significant concentration and often held in the financial sector and not necessarily even in the agriculture sector. Next slide, please, Stephen. So why in South Africa is sort of food governance absent? And despite the constitution, which guarantees the right to food, and the right to nutrition for children, where the state is required to kind of ensure the progressive realization of the right, we don't see this. And hunger persists. And the question is that as a result of a lack of resources, a lack of capacity, or a lack of political will? Next slide, please, Stephen. So despite this effort through the Constitution to ensure both procedural, kind of distributive and restorative justice, this is not taking place. Fiscal resources are not an adequate explanation for that. There is enough resources in the state. Many people are berated for not spending the money or spending it inappropriately. Lack of state capacity could certainly be a reason. There is a lot of academic work and others commenting on the dissonance between very robust and very sound and very sort of admirable policies, but implementation struggles around that. An example of that is the intention of a Food Security Council to sit in the Deputy President's office that was articulated in the 2014 National Policy on Food Nutrition Security, but it's never been activated. But the reality is, as a result, we argue, as a result of this long historical normalization of hunger, the slow violence that comes with that, is that food is not politicized. Political parties will lose votes, and people will kind of tell them how they feel as a result of the absence or non-delivery in terms of housing or water or sanitation, but food is not something that does that. And as a result of that, there is this real lack of political will. Next slide, please, Stephen. So we argue that political will to address hunger is absent, and all four actors, those actor groups that Stephen mentioned, the state, the non-state actors, the general public, and hungry people, need to engage in this central challenge in South Africa, namely this absence of any political accountability to live alone food. And despite the need to engage in hunger and the challenges associated with, national policies sit and hold the kind of domain around food from a government point of view, and the private sector and the economy controls it at a deeply centralized area. So this doesn't get down to the context in which food security is experienced. And until hunger is politicized and its kind of normalized and visibilized nature is challenged, we argue that hunger will persist in South Africa for a long time still to come. So, next slide, we can pass on to the next, to Pata. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. And now let's ask Pata to bring us home right here to the UK. Pata.
Hi, I'm Pata Scott-Villiers from the Institute of Development Studies. I'm a research fellow and I work on the politics of low-income citizens. So you have here a country which is supposedly very well off. Hunger has always been a feature of UK society, but it's ebbed and flowed. The impression was perhaps that the 20th century had brought us into a time of reduced inequality and the eradication of hunger in Britain, but this was not something that was going to last. And now it's back. 1 in 4 children in the UK are not getting enough nutritious food to eat. And this has increased from 1 in 5 in 2017. Today, 9.7 million adults, 18% of the population were unable to afford enough nutritious food. That was in September of this year. And even though that is very much better than the situation in the other 2 countries, the question is, how is that possible at all in a country that claims to have such high GDP? In 2021, we had 2,000 food banks, charity food banks operating across the country. And that little graph on the right-hand side of the slide shows the number of food parcels that were given out in any one year since 2005 by one of the major charities that runs food banks in the UK. And this charity was from a very small number in 2005 way up to 2.5 million parcels that they were delivering. And as early as 2011, which is just after the global financial crisis, you had the British Medical Journal calling the food crisis in Britain, that spiked at that time because of prices of food rising, as a public health emergency. But then the question was, how much was done about it? How solid were those actions, and how well has it lasted? And the evidence is that it hasn't lasted all that well. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Here is a brief history of the politics of provisions in UK. I'm using this concept of the politics of provisions. It was coined by a historian called John Bostedt from the US. And it basically looks at the relationship between citizens and the state, but particularly those for whom provisioning of the real basics is of extreme importance, i.e. people on low incomes. So you go all the way back to the 16th century at a time of economic stress and famine, and there were plenty of riots and protests going on. So the people were expressing themselves, and Queen Elizabeth I introduced the UK's first poor laws, which protected the indigent and the unemployed with relief, with bread subsidy, and supported small businesses with tools and support to improve their ability to buy food. Those laws carried on throughout the 17th century and gradually sort of faded away in terms of their usefulness. So by the 18th century, where you've got this agricultural revolution and an industrial revolution, which pushed millions of people into food insecurity, you had the return of riots and insurrections. So people expressing their sense of a right to food, calling on those Elizabethan laws that stated that the person had a right to a fair price for bread. They were felt entitled to riot to express that political point. By the 19th century, these riots and what they were called insurrections had been very much suppressed, and the free market idea had become absolutely accepted by all, such that there was a new poor law instituted, which was very much harsher. So relief for people in trouble was given through these workhouses where people had to go and do forced labor. So this idea of working to feed yourself, and at the same time, if you couldn't feed yourself, well, you'd get a kind of nasty regime of relief, is something that was resurgent and strengthened in the 19th century. 20th century brings us the Great Depression and the World War II, and this sort of levelling up of equality in the UK and the bringing forth of the sort of our national welfare state and the rise of labour unions. And you've got a sort of decrease in inequality, and you've got an increase in food security. But what did we see by the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century? We saw this rise in the free market. The free market has become dominant, and we have really the ability to protest is very much more limited, and our ways of protesting, people's ways of protesting, are coming in through things like Brexit, our leaving of the European Union, which is this ironic connection of elites wanting to get away from regulation of the market, which introduced environmental regulations or fair work rules, and poor people who were trying to protest against the situation they found themselves in. And at the same time, so we see the welfare state in UK being dismantled and the unions being suppressed. Next slide, please. So just a quick analysis of this, of the dynamics of this slow violence and looking at it today. I start in the top left with this idea that the market is the thing that that can deal with hunger. The market has to be let loose to do its work. And the way in which the UK has allowed its relief programs and its welfare programs to be taken over by our civil society, our charities, who are giving out food to the people who need it most, which include workers, nurses, and transport workers, and so on. This idea that the government puts its subsidy into business, it gives it to supermarkets so they can give their money to food banks rather than through a welfare system, is one part of the power dynamic. Then you have the legal side. There is no legal right to food in the UK. That means you can't take the state to court for its failure to protect you as an individual. Meanwhile, the market, the law protects the market freedom rather more assiduously than the individual ability to eat. And then down the bottom right hand side, you have the psychology of this, the shaming of people who are poor, the shaming of people whose diets are bad because they can't afford anything else, which is connected to the fact there's no official data on hunger. And there's a lot of demeaning of people who are hungry. And then finally, coming back around the circle, the morality of the question of being hungry has been put into the hands of, into the responsibility of the worker or the one who fails to work for this free market economy. Thank you. Handing over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Petter, and thanks to all the presenters. As you can see, some very interesting thinking and some preliminary analysis of these issues that we want to focus on in this research, but it's still very much preliminary. We are starting out on a big research agenda. And I guess if you see a similar title in a seminar that's advertised in about 2 years' time, you might get some answers to these questions, because that's the idea. We would like to understand why there aren't more food riots, why supermarkets aren't being invaded, why governments aren't doing more. So yes, we've started to unpick some of these issues, but we're also keen to hear your views and get your comments and feedback. So what I want to do now is hand over to Scott, who's going to chair the discussion remotely. So let's see how that works. Scott, can you hear us?
Stephen, I can very well, thank you. And indeed, thank you to all of you on the panel for, I think, this is the second time that I've engaged this paper, and certainly I think the strengthening, the crystallization of these ideas, certainly 2 years to go, but already important insights. The way I'd like to do this, make a few remarks from my side, maybe stimulate or provoke a few thoughts, and then I would like to facilitate a discussion. We have the chat function, so if people online would like to pop in questions or indeed raise their hands, I can facilitate that. Unfortunately, I'm looking at the room from behind you, so I can't see in person who is raising a hand. It's like a big brother gazing down on your backs, behind your necks. So Stephen, if I could appeal to you to perhaps take questions from in the room, and we could manage that. And then on the hour, we will wrap it up. So just a few comments. The political economy, the long-term historical overview, I think all of this just gives so much insight into these questions in terms of these different case studies. For me, the unsurprising relationship between democracy and voice, a responsive state, I think comes out very powerfully in all of the case studies. Indeed, also the arguments around economic orthodoxy, and I think that is key. So here we have a story in Brazil around, shall we call it Lula to Bolsonaro, to whom? So what is that trajectory going to mean for these questions? In South Africa, a long history of racial exclusion and exploitation, but consolidated in the last 30 years by a democratic state that has a particular ideology with issues around state capture and indeed the embrace of a particular kind of economic orthodoxy, the casualization of the economy. In the UK, for me, that very powerful argument about the dismantling of the welfare state, the erosion of worker rights, of unions being suppressed, and again, the elevation of trickle-down economics. When we talk to issues of rights and law, when we think about the legal right to food, well, there's none in the UK, as we heard from Pata. It's a paper tiger in South Africa, as Gareth made. Indeed, the issue of being able to ensure that right is in many ways a fabrication. It exists on paper, it doesn't exist in reality. And indeed, in Brazil, we saw the steady dismantlement of that right in the last 6 or 7 years. And then in terms of governance, my last point, some levels we can look at the institutional arrangements, in other words, how we arrange ourselves as government and the strength of silos. So in other words, government not being able to work towards meeting that right or working towards eradicating hunger, but also questions of capacity. And those two things, those arrangements and that capacity requiring will to drive them, and that being missing. And I think that came out strongly in all three as well. So those are just broad overview comments from me. And now to turn to yourselves in terms of questions, and a few have come up in the comment boxes. So now let's have the question. So the first is, Nidhi, your question, and this is to the panel. What are your thoughts on the United Kingdom's national food strategy in tackling hunger and food insecurity? Hata, that is very much for you. Another question, and I'll raise a few of these before inviting a response. To what extent do established social protection systems in the three countries, some examples were given, what extent do they provide viable platforms, potentially at least, for an assault on hunger? So connecting social protection as a way of a platform of the beginning of then that response. A question from Padam in the question and answers, how to address the problem of proper, efficient government mechanisms to deliver food or feed hungry people. How effectively are the charities or other agencies to take that role? So I can re-articulate that question if it's not clear, but it is in the chat for the panelists. So let's start with those three. Pata, maybe if I could turn to you for a response to the one directly, and then to Gareth and Renata to respond to the one on social protection, and indeed the other. Thanks.
Thanks for that question. It's very important. The National Food Strategy in the UK was put together at the end of the COVID crisis, or the most intense period of it, and really went into the entire system and looked at it in forensic detail and made many extremely important recommendations. But the important thing, I think, to understand is that the political will to respond to that strategy is one that is very ideologically affected. And it does matter, but it almost doesn't matter whether you're on the right or the left of British politics, that the answer to all of these very carefully enumerated problems is always seen to be the market, that the market will provide. If only growth was working as it should do, then everything else will flow from that. And if you do anything to support people in difficulty, you will be anti-growth, and therefore your the food solutions won't come. And so, however brilliant that plan, that strategy, I think the way it's going to be implemented, or the way it is already being implemented, is indicative of an ideological approach.
Lata, thank you very much. The social protection question, perhaps Gareth, if I could ask you to respond to that in the context of South Africa first.
Sure, thanks. and yes, it is certainly an essential lifeline, and it is really the child grant and equally the old age pension grant and a number of other grants, and the struggle now around the social relief grant during COVID have all provided a huge sort of lifeline to society. Well, I'm not advocating at all for these to be removed. For us, we're part of a group actively trying to seek the basic income grant so as to ensure that, and to provide extra support through the state, through these mechanisms, to allow active sort of access to a number of food, and it's essential. I do think what it does from the state is, often when we engage government officials, they argue that their progressive realization of the right to food is being addressed through the child grants. And my frustration is that the child grants provides a sort of masking, or all the grants are masking between, and sort of lets the state off the hook in that process, where I would argue they have to actively engage in the deeper systemic failures that have been kind of embedded in the last 30 years, but also have the slow violence of this long historical trajectory. And so I wouldn't say this is a band-aid. It's an essential and a critical part of food security response and the hunger response, but I do feel that it lets the state off the hook to do the hard work in undoing the systemic lock-ins and the deep structural challenges that we have in a deeply inequitable society. I can comment on a little bit further, but let me leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Gareth. Though certainly a deeper transformational approach needed, which is, I think, the way the question was going. Renata, the same question to you in terms of social protection in Brazil and Bolsa Familiar.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for the question. It's absolutely clear that having a social protection scheme is fundamental. It's a matter of rights, of protecting rights. And that works, I can say worked well in Brazil during 2003 to 2015, during the Lula's and Dilma government. And yes, Bolsa Familia, the family grant program, played a quite important role. But it is also important to say that cash transfers, as Bolsa Familia did, is not enough if it is set in place in a, let's say, an adverse context. Bolsa Familia was fundamental, was important, yes, but as important as this, perhaps more, it's been the creation of employment and the recovery of the minimum official minimum wage, purchasing power. I can make a comparison to make this point clear. We've been having now again cash transfers, but cash transfer in a context of unemployment and informality and bad paid job, low paid job. And the people in our survey, the people that receive the cash transfer, keep on saying we are not food security, we feel ourselves food insecurity. And why is that? Because some instruments of social protection, such as cash transfer, when families receive this in a context of not having job, having debt to pay and other expenses, the effect of cash transfer is much lower than it used to have to be in the past, where cash transfer was accompanied by employment and wage. So social transfer, social protection, as in the form of social transfer, is important, but it's not enough. This is why I highlighted in my presentation that if Brazil has succeeded in facing overcoming hunger, that was due not only to having one instrument, but a bunch of integrated policies. This is why I said there is no silver bullet. So cash transfer and other instruments of social protection without a context more positive in terms of employment and purchasing power of the people has a less effect, less impact. Thank you.
Renata, thank you. I'm going to ask another question, which I think does cover all of the case studies. And indeed, I would be also interested to draw Stephen in to give sort of a broader response as well. But just to sort of paraphrase Alex Shanklin's question. So to Renato, and then to Gareth, and then to Pata. To Renato, do you see similarities between the patterns of the state agribusiness relations in Brazil and the South African patterns of corporate food system capture described by Gareth? So Renato, a question for you, and then maybe a response from Gareth. And then in terms of the UK pattern of subsidy to market access rather than citizens described by Pata. Pata, perhaps you could also then bring that in. Here we're looking at other forces outside of the state, the elite capture, the state capture, and in terms of the power of then shaping the food system and then essentially driving this normalization of hunger and the social acceptance thereof. So Renato, back to you first, then Gareth and Pata. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for your question. Yes, it's possible to find similarities between the Brazilian and South African cases. In our case, the capture of the agribusiness sector, of the agenda, is increasing. I'm not sure if we can say this, the same thing about South Africa, but we are talking about a huge power of business that respond to that situation of Brazil being one of the most important exporters, food exporters in the world. So this is a quite special condition, let's say, that gives a strong power to this sector. How this affect the strategies, countries' strategies? Well, it's quite clear for us that the importance of the so-called agribusiness sector and food industry, it's expressed in the share of these people in public budget, in credits and subsidies. But at the same time, we experienced a situation of having this. I think that Brazil is one of perhaps the only country in the world that used to have in the past two ministries for dealing with agriculture. One that dealt with the agribusiness sector, and the other that dealt with family farmers and agrarian reform. So this two way of dealing with agriculture, it coexisted, but not without tension and conflicts. So I had to add this comment, because it's not only the question of agribusiness, but having also this huge number of family farmers that plays an important role in the food provision. But it's quite clear the power asymmetries between them.
Thank you, Renato. And on power asymmetries in South Africa and the UK, Gareth?
Absolutely. So on the point of power asymmetries that we have, I think the state in South Africa likes dealing with organized structures. They kind of really battle to deal with society at large, and I think it's the state in most places. So we see very powerful food and agribusiness lobby groups having a direct access to the state, almost kind of influencing the state, having previews of draft legislation before they're put out for public comment, and being able to manipulate that. So we see this very untoward tactic playing out, where there is this almost collusion between the state and the private sector. Where the state excludes those powerful lobby groups from structures, you see lawfare, you see active challenges to try and secure that. We saw that in the sugar-sweetened beverages kind of processes. We're seeing it in infant formula and other processes taking place in South Africa, where civil society and research institutions have to play a very active role in calling that out. The challenge that I think, and just again to keep this brief, is part of this is a misguided understanding of what will address hunger on the part of the state. So because of this national dominance that we have around food security and the food security programming, they see it as if we produce more food, we will have greater access to food. And anyone who can enable access to food at an efficient level can only be the private sector and big business. This, despite the fact that all our survey work finds that the majority of households, particularly the poorer households, use the informal sector as their source of access. And that is unregulated. It's something that the state doesn't understand. And we see clearing operations, we see them being treated. And my colleague Caroline Skinner, who's linked to IDS through WeGo, has commented on this often around the sort of brutal treatment of the informal economy, despite the fact that they are often the primary source of food access for many of the urban poor. Let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Gareth. Pata, over to you, your response.
There are, I think, tremendous parallels, certainly with what Gareth has just said about South Africa, and also in terms of the structures of social welfare. There's parallels with Brazil in UK. But going back to the point about market actors, I myself was surprised by the degree to which most recent responses to the enormous rise in food insecurity that has been going on this very year was so purely a matter for market actors, supermarkets and so on, and that the civil society has been working with tremendous energy to both criticize this, but also to provide, to fill this gap through the food banks, and knowing that this itself was a sticking plaster that was actually enhancing the very system that was creating the unequal access to not just healthy food, but healthy communities, healthy work environments, and so on. So there's a lot of debate inside UK civil society about how to get out of this problem, which is essentially, coming back to my point about a political, ideological issue. I think the government of the day, whichever one it is really trying hard to show that leaving the European Union was a good idea, and that any subsidy to business that can be provided to big business who have the big lobbies is something that is going to win them favors. There are different sectors of the population. People on pensions have a greater voting power than people on welfare. So there's, those sorts of adjustments are also made. It seems to me to be subsidy of market actors in a very political way.
Pata, thanks so much. Stephen, may I refer to you to please take any questions that may be in the room?
Absolutely, yes. Thanks very much for that. We do have a few hands and we have a few minutes, so let's get through them. Let's start over here.
Hi, I suppose this is a question more for Pata, but one thing I find interesting is that there is an authoritarian populism link somewhere there, and authoritarian populism's impact on food security was interesting. But Pata, I wonder about the inclusion of Brexit and the European Union in this, because I mean, if you look at other measures like the UK's Gini coefficient, after Brexit, it actually went down. So total levels of inequality in the UK did actually go down after Brexit. And then in the history of UK food provision, Brexit's presented as a sort of a return to free market economics, but the European Union itself is also a free market body that has competition laws. And there are states within the EU, like Norway, outside of the EU, like Norway, where I would imagine you could do an interesting contrast. So I was wondering, I can see like some interesting counterintuitive or research around to what extent has Brexit actually caused an increase in food security? Or is it not just the populism part with Brexit? I'm not convinced that there's a direct link from the EU as a body and Brexit to food insecurity or food security.
Just before you answer, can I clarify, you can all hear that, can you, panelists? You can hear the questions. Okay, let's take a few and then we'll give a last chance for the panelists. Yes.
What you said that was quite interesting was about kind of social movement responses to food insecurity. And I think specifically, like I've just moved from South Africa to the UK, and comparing the landscape where I was, in rural KwaZulu-Natal, while people were rioting and looting shops, for political reasons, but I think also because of poverty due to COVID, versus like a UK that's very suppressive society. What I think is going to be interesting in your analysis is looking at kind of those comparative factors and kind of decoupling some of the drivers that you mentioned, like socio-political histories or struggle and things like that. So I'm just interested to know, I mean, you explained that the countries that you've chosen and why you're looking at them, but how, if and how are you going to be doing the comparative analysis of kind of those kind of drivers and factors?
Interesting. Yes, at the back.
Can I just sort of partly following on from that, but it's a comment on the UK really, where to my mind, there's been a lot of publicity from celebrity chefs and footballers. So Marcus Rashford and Jamie Oliver, people like that, have been the key lobbyists as far as I can see. I'm just wondering if that's significant and in what way, and do you see a parallel in other countries? I mean, we're not having riots here, but we're having Jamie Oliver complaining about things, which is and embarrassing the government. So I mean, it's maybe serving the same purpose as a riot in a way.
Yeah, very interesting. Panelists, let me just say, I'm going to take two more questions and then you feel free to cherry pick whichever ones you want to answer. But some of these are very interesting insights in their own right. So maybe two more. John?
Thank you. Great set of presentations and provocative points. I was thinking about this politics of provision that Pata raised, and I know she's done work on that for quite a long time with Naomi Hussein and others. And thinking back to the food price riots of 2007-8, in that period where there were riots in over 30 countries around the world. And citizens did mobilize to challenge their governments at the time. And we're hearing now that there is a kind of reluctance or a limited capacity to take to the streets in the same way. I'm wondering what's changed from that time. The other thing I'm wondering about is what changes resulted from those riots. Were there any governments who actually, when confronted with those people, said, we need to change the way we do provide support, whether it's social protection or other measures that have been discussed. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. What happened and what did we learn?
Great question. Do you have a last one? Yes, last question.
Hi, and great presentations as well. I work on poverty quite a bit, and a lot of the structural determinants and reasons, the power dynamics, the lack of political will, and so on, is very much also reasons that poverty persists. So I was just wondering what specifically was unique to hunger as opposed to other forms of injustice, social harms like poverty, for example.
Wow, okay. It seems like another research agenda has just emerged. Great. Who wants to go first? Last round of feedback from the panelists. Renato.
Just a couple of words. Thank you for the question. And 2 points. First, on food provision, it's quite clear that in Brazil, food provision is under private regulation for a long time now. But even if this is true, it's also important to take into account the conflicts inside government around this topic, because sometimes we tend to take government and governance as a whole, as a block. They are not. And conflicts are quite important, even in Brazil. But as Scott mentioned in some moment of his reactions, democracy is the question. Food politics depends strongly to the democratic environment in order to have some success, some exit. So in our case, it's clear that the move towards a more authoritarian regime is compromising the possibility of our field. I mean our field because in some way I consider myself part of it, of this resistance. It limited the possibility, but the conflict is there. This is quite important. If not, we are here to say, okay, nothing to do, and the corporates are taking the power of everything, which is not true. And my second point has to do with food riots. Since the beginning of our common work, I've been thinking about these food riots. We used to have food riots in the past. I mean, food riots by the hungry people themselves. I'm not sure about the outcomes of this, if that had important outcomes. In societies in Brazil, what we had more is repression, is a sort of policy power over these people. But food riots, not in terms of hungry people directly, because they don't used to do this. Perhaps this is a feature of the authoritarian aspect of Brazilian society. But movements such as family farmers, even people around what I call the political field, around food security, yes, you have important consequences in terms of this public manifestation. And this is true also during this period that we are passing through, because the social resistance is in place. We're not having the same possibilities as we used to have in the democratic period. This is why I start my presentation by saying the redemocratization of Brazil after the military rule was crucial for the emerging of this movement, as well as the authoritarian period we're passing through is crucial to understand what's going on. And thank you very much for the opportunity of sharing some ideas with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Renato. Let's go to Gareth next.
So I'll leave the politics of provisions questions to Pata, sorry. And I think, I mean, Stephen and Pata and myself, we've had this interesting kind of conversation around what happened in South Africa around the sort of riots in July last year in KwaZulu-Natal, and whether that was really a sort of insurrection or some other form of revolt, and whether it was actually embedded in, given what was taken, whether it was a food riot. But for me, I'd like to, if I can, respond to the question around the difference between a study on hunger and a study on poverty explicitly. I don't want to try and draw in comparisons, but what is particularly interesting for us is that the grade of hunger is, and it might seem like a strange comment, but often we find that, households are suffering from a measure of food insecurity. They're not getting the right food. They're reducing the diversity of diets. They're not necessarily in poverty, but they're reducing diets and they're starting to experience food poverty. They're making really awful decisions on whether to kind of buy a new pair of school socks for their kids or whether to buy food for them. Because energy costs so much, they're deciding to choose 2-minute noodles over a more nutritious diet. These are strategic choices. This isn't the feckless poor. This isn't people making poor food decisions. They're making deeply strategic decisions. And I accept that this sits within the poverty debates as well. But I think both are linked. But what I find interesting about trying to understand hunger, and what I think is particularly useful, is it shows different strategies that are being adapted to ameliorate these issues. It shows the extreme, kind of the really awful decisions that mothers are having to make around feeding their children, around what might be the next meal, around how to provision and provide for a child who the decision might be around satiation rather than nutrition because of these situations. So it allows one to see those issues, but it also allows one to see wider multidimensional poverty. So our work enables us to see the connections between the costs of energy and food provision, between transport and food provision, between time poverty and food provision, and those various different things, those deeply gendered decisions that have to be made. So they are connected, but it allows a nuance and it allows us to see things slightly differently. I know I haven't answered the question and I might not have been helpful, but let me leave it at that.
Thanks, Gareth. And Pata, all the remaining questions are for you.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Brexit. I think that was Philip. This particular the particular argument about what Brexit was doing and why it was useful is, I think, one which was to get away from not just the free market approach of the EU, but an even more free market that we could become part of when we'd left the constraints of the terribly bureaucratic European Union. And the result, I think you could strongly argue, was that the loss of a whole range of civil liberties, but also of protection of workers and protection of basic food rights and things like that is incontrovertible. You can't say that hasn't occurred. So it's not that there's a direct relationship between leaving the EU and food insecurity, but it's certainly added to the ability of turmoil, wherever it's coming from, in food prices to allow people to fall into greater levels of hunger, and then for a particular kind of governmental response to that problem, which then brings you to Marcus Rashford, who I must say I was very much persuaded by. I think he's a remarkable person. Actually, also all the other celebrity chefs, they play an important part, but essentially what they're doing is picking up and pushing another element of the same process of government irresponsibility, and the individuals being left to pick up the pieces, and the celebrities, attempting to give voice to that, rather than a truly political process whereby someone who is hungry has rights and is able to express their need and their right for government to do things differently. And then finally, this point from John about the why are there less riots today? I think in UK, I think riotousness has its seasons, and I think you get processes of governmental response, which is what the politics of provision suggests, that in some ways can respond to riots, usually in several years after the actual event, by putting in place social welfare mechanisms and so on, partly in order to prevent the population from doing that sort of thing again, or from voting against the said government. the last clear riots we had in UK were in 2011, and they started in a very poor area of East London, the really big ones, and that spread across UK. But they weren't about food, apparently. But of course, the people who were doing the rioting, some black person got killed by a policeman in the back of a police car, and boom, there were massive riots. The food element of that was present, and that's often the case with rioting. It's never one thing, and it's always a point of, we just simply aren't going to put up with this anymore. It's a very expensive and dangerous thing to do, to riot, and so any other way of trying to both deal with the situation and also protest against it will be used first. And just to come back to Gareth's point about the sense of responsibility of people who are on low incomes and are trying to feed their families, the first thing they say to you is that we will do everything. We will work 3 jobs. We will, go up here and do this and do that, just in order to be able to fulfill our responsibility. And the more that is considered to be the way things have to be done, the easier it is to normalize hunger for those who simply do not have the conditions to be able to do that and actually bring in enough money to feed their families or feed themselves properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pata. We've gone past 2 o'clock here in the UK. Scott, do you have any final comment of your own before we close?
No, just to say thank you and best of luck to the process.
Thank you, Scott. And thanks to all the panelists, and thanks to all of you here. I don't want to take any more time, just to say that you've actually given us more food for thought for this research agenda, which, as you heard, is emerging and evolving. And certainly we've got new ideas for the next 2 years of work ahead of us. So do come back in 2 years' time and hear some answers to the questions you asked today, as well as those we're asking ourselves. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.